Nscaler454 here. Welcome back to the channel. I've been model railroading for quite a few years now. In fact, you've seen me build my entire layout right from the beginning. And in that time, I have learned a lot of things. So I'm going to give you my top 20 tips and suggestions that can help you with your layout. So stay tuned. Choose the scale that you want to model. Now this might sound simpler than it actually is. The majority of model railroad enthusiasts prefer HO scale. It's got the most variety, the most availability, and of course, it's incredibly detailed. The drawback is the space required, especially if you want to build a large layout of your dreams. And that is where N scale becomes much more appealing. You can achieve some very realistic detailing in a much smaller space. It's about half the size as HO scale. So if you want to run long trains or fit a lot of features into a small space, then N scale might be the choice for you. Though if you're unwilling to sacrifice the detail or limit your availability, or maybe you actually have the space, then HO is a wonderful choice. Of course, you could go with smaller scales like Z or larger scales like O, and while they do have their advantages, they have a much more limited selection. How big of a layout should you build? Short answer, go as big as you possibly can, or at the very least, plan for expansion. You won't regret it. Now, there are two main factors that you want to consider. The obvious is how much space do you actually have for your layout? And number two, how much time and money do you have available for that layout? Because let's be honest, a train layout is expensive and also time-consuming. So be realistic, but don't be afraid to be ambitious. If you have been dreaming of a huge layout of your dreams with lots of operations, then a simple circle layout is probably not going to entertain you for very long. Having said that, a typical 4x8 layout can give you quite a lot of satisfaction if you're a little bit creative. To be perfectly honest, building the layout can be just as much fun or more than actually running the trains. Planning software. Is it actually worth it? Well, it certainly can be. I've designed layouts in a variety of different ways. I've drawn it by hand, I've used CAD software, I've also used dedicated model railroading program software, specifically AnyRail, and I can tell you that AnyRail has been by far the best solution. For large layouts with lots of switches and different radius curves, then layout software can definitely help narrow down a design and save you lots of time and money in the long run. The changes are quick and easy and of course free. It can also show you if some of your ideas are even possible, because in the real world, some things just don't work out. Now, I guarantee you, when it comes time to actually lay down the track, you will change your plan 100%. So don't spend so much time on the planning stage, because things are going to change around a little bit. Now, if you are planning just a simple roundy round circle or oval type layout, maybe just one switch, then layout software probably isn't required. Hills and curves can have a huge impact on the operation of your trains. Trains do not like going up inclines, especially when going through a curve. Now, I made a video on this that shows just how quickly it can impact the length of your trains. So I recommend a maximum of 2% grade and a minimum of 18-inch radius continuous curve, obviously an N scale. For HO, I guess you're looking at probably like 36-inch radius. I'm not 100%, but that 2% grade still applies. Now, obviously, you can get away with tighter curves and steeper grades. Sometimes your layout forces you into that, but just keep in mind, it can bring some issues with that. Obviously, the steeper the curve, the harder your locomotive is going to have to pull up the trains, and you're going to be forced into either shorter trains, or you're going to be forced into running more locomotive power. I've done a pull test video that can help you visualize that, so check that out. Tighter curves are more prone to tip overs and derailments. Longer cars, like in the passenger train world, they start to look a little goofy when they navigate around tight radius curves just because of the overhang. And in some cases, you may not be able to run your long train or long car or long locomotive at all. For example, the big boy steam engine, it's just not going to be able to do a 9-inch radius curve. So plan accordingly. DC or DCC. Honestly, there's nothing wrong with DC, though it is a bit of an old school way of doing things. If you're running a simple circular layout that goes round and round, then DC makes a lot of sense and is certainly going to be the cheaper option. However, if you're starting from scratch, if you want to run a big layout, maybe lots of switches, lots of operation, or if you want to run multiple locomotives at once, well, then DCC is going to be the best choice. Sound or no sound? Obviously, this is going to be a personal preference, so I highly recommend you go and attend some train shows, go down to your local hobby shop, and hear some locomotives for yourself. Now keep in mind, hearing these locomotives in a loud, busy environment like a train show is not going to be the same as hearing it in a quiet, smaller, closed room inside your house. Holy crap, this thing is loud! But it'll give you a really good idea. HO scale have phenomenal sound, lots of volume, but the sound even in N scale has improved a lot and is still very, very good. Now, me personally, I will not purchase a locomotive that does not have sound equipped right from the factory. Now, I do know that you can install your own speakers and sound decoders on locomotives that you may already have, but it's going to be more cost effective and certainly more convenient to buy it with the sound already installed from the manufacturer. Adding lights to your layout. Now this can seem like a bit of a who cares kind of topic. Well, in my experience, I have found that not only does lights add a level of realism to your layout, but it also can change the experience. Now, let's say you've been running your trains around for the week and it's starting to get a little bit boring. Well, you can turn off the main lights, flick on the lights on your layout, and suddenly your experience changes and the enjoyment factor is back. And I really love that about that. Plus, I think it looks just really damn cool. Now, it is possible to add lights to a layout that's already been established and built, but there's certainly nothing wrong with planning ahead. It is going to require a whole wiring system underneath, your benchwork to power all those lights, so you need to account for that. So planning for your lighting in the buildings and on your scenes, doing that ahead of time can save you some time, some money, and some headaches later on. When you start building your layout, you're going to need to decide on your layout height. And to me, it makes sense to build it around how you're going to operate. Are you going to be sitting? Are you going to be standing? Or some combination of both? Obviously, if you're going to run a double-decker layout, then you're going to need to plan accordingly to that. Just remember, you're going to have to get under your layout to run your wires and such. When it comes to Benchwork Materials, you can actually save quite a bit of money here, but it can come at a cost. I do not like using 2x4s to build your benchwork framing. It's fine for legs, but not so much for the framing. I started off using 2x3s to save a few bucks, but then I went to 1x3s because I found that you want as much building area underneath your layout as possible, and 1x3s just have less of a footprint. And so like your switch machines or where your turnouts are going to be, your wiring and all that kind of stuff, especially through these cross bracings and whatnot, you're going to want that extra space. So that 1 inch here and there can make a difference. I used cheap lumber from Home Depot, and sadly to say, lumber is getting worse and worse in terms of quality. It's not that straight, it's twisted and whatever. There are better materials out there, but they're more expensive. So choose your poison. I used 3/8 plywood for my benchwork, and I'm sure it would have been sturdier and flatter had I used 1/2 inch, but once again, saving some money. And it seems to be sufficient for N scale, so it doesn't seem to be too much of a problem. I do recommend using foam board foam insulation board on top. It's not required, but not only does it help insulate against or reduce the noise when your trains are going over, but it allows for more terraforming. You can dig down and for ditches or maybe streams and rivers and whatnot, or you can add layers and build up hills and mountains. So it's a really good material. I used 1/2 inch. Once again, saves cost. But a lot of people prefer to use 2 inch, which is quite thick to me. Because if you're using a switch machine or whatnot, that wire that stick up, it has to go through 2 inches of foam plus your plywood material, which it can start to, create some challenges. So I liked going to a thinner material. It just made things easier for me. Now, if you have uneven floors like I do, get yourself some levelers like this. They just go on the bottom of your legs, and then you can make your layout perfectly level or close to it, which is really useful because you don't want your trains rolling down a slope every time you park them. Choosing your track is a pretty important step. The clip together track like the Kato Unitrack or whatever, incredibly popular, incredibly easy to use. However, you are restricted to the curves in the roadbed dictated by the manufacturer. Though I have seen some very impressive layouts that look very, very good. Though if you want complete freedom in your layout, you're going to have to go with FlexTrack. And in my opinion, I think FlexTrack looks the most realistic. Another thing to consider is the code of your track, which is the height of your rail. N-Scale has code 80 and code 55. Code 55 is the shorter rail. In fact, I think N-Scale has code 40, which is a little bit harder to find. But typically, the shorter the rail, the more realistic it looks. I do know that you can piece together different brands and whatnot of track, but I highly recommend sticking to the same code, same brand, whether it's Unitrack or Atlas or Pico, whatever. It just makes things a lot easier. And also, everything will be a little more uniform, visually speaking. Track work. This is a big one. Take your time and do the best track work you possibly can to avoid stallouts and derailments. You want to do a good job and you don't want to have problems in the future, because once you have your ballast and ground cover down, you're either living with it or you're tearing it up. Be accurate when you're cutting your track. You don't want to have huge gaps. I mean, obviously gaps are essential for expansion, but if they're too big, you could lose conductivity or your trains could just run like crap over it. If you're using FlexTrack, a wonderful product to help you with track alignment and to bend your curves is this product called Tracksetta from Pico. It comes in different curves. So this is a 15-inch radius curve. This is an 18-inch radius curve. Obviously, these are N-Scale. And then we have a straight one. Now, you might not think the straight one is useful. It is extremely handy. I can't tell you how many times I've used it for straightening track or just aligning curves and whatnot. You definitely want to get the straight one. I actually do recommend getting a 21-inch radius if you have enough room on your layout to do it. If you have a joint in the middle of a curve where two tracks join together, be sure to solder that joint before making the curve. Otherwise, you may end up with a kink like I did. Don't solder on the inside of your track, whether you're doing your feeder wires or your joints. You want to do that on the outside. That will ensure that when your trains go over it, it won't have any problems interfering with the wheels. Ensure you have enough feeders going to your track, again with good soldered connections. I recommend putting feeders to your turnouts. That's a critical spot with your track. A good multimeter is a great tool for checking conductivity as well as polarity and for diagnosing any kind of problems. If you have a modular type layout where the two sections butt together, try to avoid putting a curved track in there, because at that cut point, it's really hard to keep that track aligned, especially if you take it apart and try putting it back together. It is much easier to try getting two pieces of straight track to go together than it is to a curved one. Bottom line, do a good job now so you're not suffering later. Wiring can be a bit of an art form. Some people do an amazing job. Some people do a less than amazing job, to the point where it's a complete mess. Now, obviously, I'm going to say do the best job you can, but keep it organized. Not only will that help you if you have to troubleshoot later on, but you have to place buildings and track on your layout, and you're going to have to drill down through your benchwork. And you don't want to be drilling into your wires because you didn't keep it organized. Now, I use 12 gauge stranded wire for my bus wires and 22 gauge solid core wires for my feeders. And I like to connect everything through distribution blocks, so power going in and then feeders going out, obviously positive and negative. Some tools that I would recommend for building your layout: a chop saw or a circular saw to cut the wood for your benchwork. You're not going to want to do that with a handsaw. You may need a jigsaw for elaborate shapes, or maybe cutting a hole in your layout for a turntable or something. Obviously, you will need a drill. For soldering your track and your wires, you're going to need a soldering gun or soldering station. I prefer the wired soldering station because they give you good consistent power. Get yourself a square like this. I use it all the time, super handy. Otherwise, you will need to get an assortment of squares and rulers and measuring tape. That's pretty obvious. Spreader tools like a putty knife. Some of the plastic ones, super cheap, but they're good for spreading glue and plaster and whatever, so those are handy. A set of wire strippers, as you're doing your wiring, makes things nice and easy. You're going to need some flush cutters like this. That's for cutting track. You can also cut wire and whatnot, so very handy. You can also use a Dremel with a cutoff wheel to cut your track. It works, and also these are very handy for a lot of other things, but I wouldn't really say it's required. Now, if you're going to put switch machines in, like the Tortoise, they come with a hardened steel wire, so you're going to need to get a proper set of side cutters, or use the side cutter notch on some needle nose pliers or whatever. The point is, you need to have a proper set, because if you use your hobby flush cutters, you're going to destroy the edge. So just be aware of that. Now, depending on the size of your layout or how crazy you're getting with your design, some of these things might be optional, but the bigger your layout gets, the more required these tools are going to be. Be as cost effective as you possibly can. Now, this might be super obvious, but places like train shows, swap meets, buy and sells like Craigslist, Kijiji, or Facebook, there are a lot of places where you can get some really good deals on some used or even new products versus spending full retail price on every single product that you buy. Also, name brand companies sell common hardware materials at a premium cost under their brand's umbrella. Things like plasters, paint, glue, all can be found at much cheaper prices. The reality is, model railroading is expensive, and it's getting worse. So anywhere you can save a buck is helpful. Buy in bulk. Now, this might depend on the size of your layout, but you will be surprised at just how much material you will go through. Plaster is a big one. If you're doing mountains or rock faces or cliffs or whatever, if you think this little jug is going to be enough, it won't be. Buy the big bag. Ground cover, whether it's foliage or dirt or whatever, once you figure out your primary colors that you're going to use the most, get the big jug. You can use the small bags for the highlights or whatever. Wire, same kind of deal. A 100-foot spool is you'll be surprised how quickly you might go through that. But it's probably going to be more cost effective to buy the 100-foot spool than multiples of the 25-foot spool. And the whole point here is just to buy lots early, because it will save you a bunch of money in the end. Acrylic paint over oil paint. 99% of the time, I am painting with acrylics for my buildings and my layout. It's easy to apply, it's easy to thin, and more importantly, it's easy to clean up. It cleans up with straight water, and it cleans up even better with isopropyl alcohol, which also means that you can use water and IPA as a paint thinner. You don't have to buy a dedicated thinner like this. That's going to be a lot more expensive, though you should test it out, because not all paints are compatible with different thinners. For example, IPA does not work well with Vallejo paints. So just one example. Oil paints, you're going to need a dedicated paint thinner, like a turpentine or whatever. Obviously that stinks. It's toxic. Just a little less desirable to use. These spray cans right here, they stink pretty bad. It's a powerful smell. So you don't want to be spraying this inside your house. Whereas the acrylic paints, there's not much odor at all. I do recommend going to a craft store and picking up like tubes of these paints for your primary colors, like your white, black, gray, brown, whatever. Much better bang for the buck than these little hobby paints like this. This is about half the price as this little guy, and look how much more you get, right? Now, some cases you're going to need to get these little ones. It's just they have the color that you exactly want. But don't be afraid to match and mix your colors to find a paint color that you like. Like, say you're at the hobby store and you're like, man, oh, dark iron gray. That looks fantastic. You might be able to get that same color or close enough by just mixing a few paints that you already have. So just one tip to save you a little bit of money. Get some elevation layers into your layout. And what I mean by this is build up. You can do this with different levels of track height, buildings, signs, trees. You can build bumps or hills or mountains. You can technically dig down and get some ditches or gullies or a variety of different water features. The whole point I'm saying is if you build your entire layout with everything on the same level as your track height, you're going to have a very two-dimensional looking layout. But if you start building with different layers, and the more different layers you can have, you know, signs or track, signs, trees, buildings, mountains, whatever, it's just going to add a much more appealing visual presence to your layout. 3D printing has changed the industry. No longer are we restricted to the latest issue of the Walthers catalog or what's available on our favorite model railroading website. There are so many options out there. And whether you have purchased your own printer and you do your own designs, or maybe you download a digital file and print it yourself, or you purchase a completed 3D printed part, there are just so many options and new things available because of 3D printing. Now, I have done so many of my own designs and printed them myself to the point where my layout is completely unique. The things I have are not available anywhere else. And that's kind of an issue and why that 3D printing is so valuable. In scales like N scale, there's like half the availability as to the things available in HO scale, and it's even worse for Z scale or O scale. And so things I could only dream of, I can now build because of 3D printing. Now, whether you're doing it yourself by investing in a printer and your own designs, or you're looking around and seeing what's available from other people that do designs and prints, take advantage of 3D printing. Some tools that I would recommend for building kits and doing scenery: a nice sharp hobby knife, that is a must. Once again, flush cutters, very important. I recommend getting ones with a nice fine point to them so you can get in those tight spaces. Files, these are great for sanding down blemishes or whatnot, maybe from the sprues on your kits. So I use just these super cheap ones from the dollar store, on plastic at least. If it's metal, you're going to need a metal file. That's important if when you're cutting track and whatnot, so you got to clean up all those burrs. Pipettes, these are awesome. So say you're diluting paint or something, you got water or IPA in here, you can easily pour that in, or maybe even just sucking up the paint, because a lot of them have measurements like this one do. So that's good. Or maybe you're pouring IPA on your ballast or pouring glue on your ballast. So lots of uses for these. Speaking of ballast, I really like these little ballasting tools. I know they're not required, but I think they make things easier, faster, more consistent. So I recommend them. 2 brushes for ballasting: a soft bristle brush like this, and a stiff bristle brush like this one. Bit of a tongue twister. Fan brush. These are awesome. I never use this for paint. I just use it for brushing around material when I'm doing scenery, maybe ballast, I'm cleaning it up, or rocks in a stream, or whatever it may be. Or maybe I'm just dusting. Honestly, these can work for dusting as well. They're awesome. They've got a nice soft bristle and they fanned out, get a nice tight spots. These are awesome. I recommend. Speaking of brushes, I don't recommend these cheap little ones that we've all seen. You have a synthetic bristle to them. I mean, they can work, but they're not the best. They don't have a fine tip, which I think is a bigger issue. So go to a hobby store or a craft store and get yourself like a 3-pack or something. I don't buy the expensive ones. I get the cheapest ones I possibly can, but they're very useful. A number 2 brush, you pretty much can't go wrong. It's kind of a jack of all trades. It works. Obviously, if you're doing bigger areas like you're doing a wash on a mountain, or maybe you're spreading some like a brown cover for dirt, then maybe a pack of big brushes like this will be useful. Again, these are like $5. If you're doing finer detail things, especially in like N scale, you may need a finer brush. I got 2 different ones here. This one has a longer bristle, but this is a number 0 brush. And this is like a 20-aught brush. You can see it's a very short bristle, but these are awesome. This is a pin vise, which is just a mini drill. But the normal sized drills, the chuck will not accept the fine, tiny little drill bits like this. And for kits, these can be really, really useful. And sometimes you just need to create a new hole. And because you're going through plastic and maybe wood at sometimes, or maybe you're planting trees or whatever, these work really, really good. So I recommend them. They're like $20 off Amazon, so they're not expensive. Stirring spoons or mixing spoons, again, not a requirement. I just like them. They're great for, especially like the Tamiya paint jugs or paint jars. Scoop out some paint, mix it up. So good for stirring, and because they're stainless steel, they're easy to clean. I like that. I should mention the cutting board right here. This is one of those self-healing ones. Maybe not necessary, but they're handy because they got all the measurements on them and they're kind of soft, and you know, you cut them with the knife, they self-heal, as they call it, but not required, because you could just use a piece of cardboard. Plus, if you paint a piece of cardboard, you're not going to care, you just replace it. I use cereal boxes and it's awesome. Makeup sponges. These are awesome for maybe texturing paint, or maybe you're going to do some rust detail or weathering on a locomotive or something. These are awesome. Plus, you can cut them to different kind of points or whatever, get in the spots that are hard to get to, but these are useful. Speaking of paint, or speaking of weathering, I should say, weathering powders are awesome, and also washes. These 2 things, you can get a really nice, decent weathering appearance on a lot of your buildings and whatnot, and it's super easy, and it's only a couple different products, so I really recommend those. Glue, I do not recommend these like the test stores glue that's, you know, it's runny, it's a pain in the butt to use. I don't recommend these, but I recommend something like Tamiya's cement, or maybe the Rebels cement that, you know, you squeeze out. A lot easier to use. They both stink though, so I mean, all glues kind of do. And finally, an airbrush. Is this required? No, it is not. But I have to say I recommend them, because you can get a night and day difference in paint job. There's the fine spray, especially in the smaller scales. Brush strokes show up and it starts to look a little bit ugly. This gives a much more uniform paint job. This right here is the airbrush that came with the compressor. It's super cheap. It's got a 0.3 millimeter nozzle on it, and it worked. I managed for years with this. Is it great? Not really, but it does the job. I just recently purchased this one right here. It comes with a 0.38 and a 0.5 nozzle. I definitely noticed a difference, but this whole thing is like $100. This one right here was about, what did I pay for it, like $70 or something like that. So, I mean, I recommend just going with an inexpensive one to start with, and then if you need to upgrade your brush later on, you can. But if you want to get serious with the painting, an airbrush is where it's at. I forgot to mention tweezers. These are vital to kit building and doing fine detail on your layout. I have like 5 different pairs of them. Of course, they're dedicated to the hobby. They're not the ones from the bathroom, but I highly recommend getting one with like this needle point. Very, very sharp. In fact, so sharp that it will stab you. It happens. I have to also recommend the Static King or some other version of a static grass applicator. Static grass is a great way to bring another level of realism to your layout. And again, we talked about layer levels and level heights. This just again brings another dimension to it. So very recommended. It makes a big difference. Last but not least, and this is probably the most important tip, just get started. Seriously, it is so easy to get stuck in the planning stage, whether that is on a computer or drawing out a layout, or maybe you've collected a whole bunch of materials. Maybe you have a whole fleet of locomotives and nowhere to use it because you don't have a layout. It's a very common problem. It even happened to me. I remember having collected all this stuff and thinking, I don't have nowhere to use it. So I went out and I grabbed some lumber and I started building my layout. And I'll tell you, it didn't go perfectly smooth. You know, I had issues. I made mistakes. I made more mistakes and redesigns than I can count. It's just part of the process. So do not be afraid of that. I remember my layout was too narrow, so I had to widen it. I think I did that twice. I had my track elevation wrong, so I ripped it up and I did it again. And I kept going on, and next thing you know, I have expanded my layout. It's just the way it goes, and any mistake is an opportunity to make things better and hopefully make you happier in the long run, because I mean, it's a hobby. That's what it's supposed to do, make us happy. So yeah, don't worry about that. Another thing people worry about is, do you have to be an artist to have a great layout? No, you do not. Obviously, an artist is going to have fabulous looking stuff that we only dream of, but the most basic artistic skills can go a long, long way, and it's shockingly easy to be able to make a good looking scene. It's amazing. Things like painting mountains and using the wash technique, or just putting on ground cover, super easy. Also, for every mistake, don't forget, you can use ground cover to cover that up. So, oh, I have this big crack or ugly part in my layout. A little bit of bushes and some grass and a tree maybe, and next thing you know, it looks great. It's that easy. So, yeah, get to it. Go start building your layout and enjoy this wonderful hobby. And that's it, folks. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button, subscribe for more videos, and as always, thanks for watching.